When we look at the literature of what we could call the Middle Ages, which means this is after 1066, after William the First conquered England, that whole period up to the end of the 14th century. If we look at the literature of this period, and we don't see Chaucer right now, we can look at Chaucer in a separate video. So what do we get to see in the name of literature? We get to see Layamon's Brut, 1205, consisting of more than 30,000 lines. And this is about Brutus. And this is the first English text in which we will get to hear of Arthur. Now, for the English people, Arthur is a legendary figure and he has great importance. Now, Layamon is not the first person, the first writer to mention Arthur. Before Layamon, there was a writer called Nennius, and he was the first to write a text in which he introduced Arthur, but he was not an Englishman. And so we do not count him. We speak of, this Layamon's Brut, in which we get to hear of Arthur. Now, there was another text after Nennius's writing, which was by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and it was called Historia Regum Britanniae. It was the history of the English kings. And then we have Layamon's Brut. And after Layamon's Brut, you have some other pieces of literature. You have the Owl and the Nightingale, in which the two birds, they speak of their relative merits. You also have Orm's Ormulum. Orm is the writer, and his text is Ormulum, Orm's Ormulum. And you have a very important piece of writing known as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, this is a romance, out and out a romance, Middle Ages, a romance of the Middle Ages. So there is, again, the court of King Arthur, and he has all his, knights around him. And this Green Knight enters the court of Arthur, and he presents a challenge. He tells any of the courtiers to strike him with an axe, but he says that after a year, the person who strikes the Green Knight with an axe, after a year, that person will have to present himself at a place called the Green Chapel, and then the same thing will be done to him. So the Green Knight will deal that same blow back to the courtier who is today ready to deal a blow to the Green Knight. Now, this is a challenge. So you strike me and I'll strike you back after a year. So now Sir Gawain comes forward. He accepts the challenge and he, beheads this man, the Green Knight. Now, this is a masked figure, and everyone is, surprised. They don't know what's happening. This person's head rolls off, and he quietly, calmly picks up the head, and he walks out of the court. And then he says that I'll meet you at the Green Chapel after a year, so you better be there. Now, these men were men of their word. And having accepted the challenge, now Sir Gawain could not possibly back out of it. So he begins his journey because it's going to take him time to reach that green chapel. He doesn't know what the green chapel is about and he doesn't know where it is. And so he begins that arduous journey. And on the way, he stops at a castle. Now, the host of this castle, as we might guess, is the Green Knight, but Sir Gawain is not going to come to know about it because he doesn't recognize the Green Knight. And so these two people, the host and Sir Gawain, they become friends and he's treated very, very well at that castle. And then this host tells Sir Gawain that from today, whatever you receive, you'll have to give me half of it, honestly. So this kind of a pact is struck between them. There will be an exchange. What he receives, half to him, and what he receives, half to him. Now, the host's wife, she comes along and she tries to, seduce this man, to lure him into a passionate thing between them. And what this Sir Gawain does is that he kisses this woman, but he doesn't go any further. And this woman, the host's wife, she gives him a magical girdle. So if he wears that girdle, he will absolutely be able to protect himself when he has to finally meet the Green Knight. And so when the host returns and asks him, so what do you have to give me? He gives him half the kisses that he has received from the host's wife. But he makes no mention of that girdle because he knows that that girdle is very important for him and that girdle will actually save him. And so he doesn't show that. Now, finally, the whole thing will be resolved and the Green Knight will reveal himself and the story will have a happy ending. So this is of unknown authorship. Nobody knows who has written this, just as The Owl and the Nightingale too is of unknown authorship. So these were some of the texts that belonged to the early part of the Middle Ages. After this, there is going to be a considerable period of, it'll be a blank period when there will be very little writing. Sir Gawain was one of the texts which came out in the later periods. Otherwise, between these other texts and Sir Gawain, there is a considerable gap. Now, if we were to look at history, English history, we would have to look at some of the kings, and we can look at Edward III. Now, this is an important name because Edward III and his reign will see a number of important events, including the coming of Chaucer. We'll do Chaucer separately in a video. So the coming of Chaucer. We will also see what is known as the 100 Years' War, which was fought between 1337 and 1453. And it was fought between the English and the French. And it was, it lasted more than 100 years, nearly 116 years. So the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453. Then another important person comes along. He's Wycliffe, John Wycliffe. He's an Oxford theologian. So he was an Oxford scholar. He was a biblical scholar and he had a thorough knowledge of the Bible, and he could argue anyone out of anything when it came to the Bible. Now, this was the time when the Pope exerted a lot of influence and the kings were afraid of the Pope. So every time a controversy came up, the king had to respond to the Pope, and the king generally didn't know what to do. And since John Wycliffe, was such a great and brilliant scholar, a biblical scholar, he was a theologian, so he was often invited by the king, and he presented brilliant arguments that would finally satisfy the Pope. Somewhere the king got the impression that this is my man. So Wycliffe is my man, and he'll always speak in my defense. Now, Wycliffe was nobody's man. He was a true biblical scholar, and he wouldn't take sides, either with the king or with the Pope. He was true to the Bible. And so a rift grew between the king and Wycliffe when Wycliffe refused to support the king on certain occasions. Now, Wycliffe was quick to see that the church was beginning to do things which were very, very unfair. It was becoming a kind of breeding ground for several evils. And so Wycliffe spoke against it. So, the Lollardy movement, this is known as the Many Reformation, the Lollardy movement. It was a group of people known as the Lollards. And Wycliffe headed this. And in fact, he prepared a kind of Bible. It underwent several revisions. So the exact year of publication would involve, this edition, this edition, this edition. It went on like this. And so Wycliffe's Bible, which underwent all these, corrections, that came out. And finally, nearing the end of the 14th century, Wycliffe died. But he had set a movement in force. And that movement would later on grow into what we know as Protestantism. And Martin Luther will come in. Martin Luther of Germany will come in. And then the Protestant thing will happen. So Chaucer we can look at in a separate video. The 100 Years' War between England and France, it involved a number of issues, mainly the English kings who chose to marry French princesses, and then they staked a claim to the throne. And, they would become kings there, and they would pay a handsome ransom kind of a thing to the French kingdom. So involving all these issues, there were differences between the English and the French, which resulted in the 100 Years' War between England and France. Now, Edward III, why do we need to see him? We need to see him because we need to know that Chaucer, whom we'll be studying later, Chaucer saw the reign of three kings. The first is Edward III. The second is Edward's son, Richard II. And the third is Henry IV. So 1399, Henry IV will become the king. And 1400, just a year later, Chaucer will die. So Chaucer saw the reign of these three kings. Now, Edward the Third had a number of sons, as used to be, it used to be the order of the day. And one of the sons was John of Gaunt, who will become the Duke of Lancaster. And we will have to see the connection between the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, and Chaucer. And so we need to remember Edward the Third. John of Gaunt will have a close association with Chaucer. John of Gaunt's wife, Duchess Blanche, will die, and Chaucer will write an elegy for her called the Book of the Duchess, which we'll be seeing later on. But right now, Edward the Third, his son John of Gaunt, and later on we'll see the connection between Chaucer and John of Gaunt and how that grows. Now, there were other writers in this period. For instance, a text called Piers the Plowman. It came out in the year 1362, and Langland is supposed to be the writer. Now, John Gower, Chaucer, and Langland, these three are, almost contemporaries, and so these three names you need to know. Piers the Plowman is an important text, and it speaks of a fair field full of people, alliteration. So there is a pit here, that's hell. And there is a high tower there, perhaps heaven. And in between is this world, this fair field full of people. So it is about, Christian salvation, how a Christian can get salvation. And the journey is from there to the high tower, passing through this fair field full of people.